Welcome, dear listener. You have found your way once again to the Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner of the internet where history unfolds slowly, gently, like the turning of an old page. This is boring history for sleep, where the past is told not with urgency or drama, but with the calm rhythm of bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling. Here, the purpose is simple: to accompany you as you drift into rest, letting the sounds of history become a soft-spoken history documentary, a kind of lullaby made of dates, places, and forgotten details. If this kind of calm bedtime storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like this video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you are awake for just a little while longer, you can leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time of night it is for you. There is something strangely comforting in knowing that somewhere else, perhaps very far away, someone else is falling asleep to the same old stories. Tonight's History Sleep story takes us into the hushed, candlelit corridors of great palaces, where servants move in silence and lives were shaped by duties that often went unseen. The title may sound dramatic. You won't believe what palace servants were forced to do, but do not worry. This is not a tale of sharp shocks or unsettling revelations. Instead, it is a slow unfolding of everyday burdens, of routines that were both ordinary and extraordinary, of small acts repeated endlessly in the shadow of thrones. Imagine yourself stepping softly across marble floors, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air is cool and faintly perfumed with beeswax and the candles, mingling with the scent of fresh rushes laid on the ground. Behind the grandeur of carved doors and gilded walls, there are lives bound to service. Young pages, cooks, laundry women, chamber attendants, and guards. Their work was constant, often invisible, yet woven into the rhythm of royal existence. We will explore their world in 4 slow segments. First, we will immerse ourselves in their daily life, imagining the smallest tasks and the patterns of their days. Then, we will follow a particular figure, a biography that illustrates not just one person's story, but the way a single life reveals a larger truth. After that, we will move into the realm of mystery, archaeology, and culture, considering what traces of these servants remain in the records and the artifacts they left behind. Finally, we will contrast their existence with the social and elite lives they served, finding both the distance and the strained connections between rulers and those who stood quietly in the background. There will be no rush. Each detail will linger, like the slow chiming of a distant clock. If you find your eyelids growing heavy, that is all as it should be. You may drift in and out, catching fragments, or let the entire story pass by as you rest. History is patient. It will wait for you. So, dim the lights, let the past whisper softly, and together we will step into the quiet world of palace servants, their burdens, their rituals, and their forgotten labors. The palace was never entirely silent, not even in the depth of night. Long before the sun's first suggestion of light brushed the horizon, the household servants began their movements. Imagine yourself within those halls, not as a guest, not as a monarch, but as one of those whose lives were shaped entirely by duty. You would be roused from a simple bed, often little more than a straw-filled mattress, long before others awoke. The air would be cool, sometimes cold, and the stones beneath your feet unforgiving. There was a rhythm to this early rising, a rhythm that became so habitual it was scarcely thought about. Before a candle was lit in a chamber, before a royal voice broke the silence, servants were already at work. The first duty was often fire, coaxing the embers from the previous night back into life. This was no small matter. In grand halls with their soaring ceilings and drafty windows, warmth was not guaranteed. A page, often a boy of only 10 or 12, would be tasked with carrying wood and kindling, carefully arranging it so that by the time the master or mistress stirred, the room would glow gently with renewed flame. The corridor smelled of ash, beeswax, and fresh rushes. Imagine the soft rasp of straw brooms brushing against stone, the muted thud of wooden buckets carried along passageways, the creak of doors that were never truly at rest. Servants worked quietly, always aware that sound carried. The aim was to be invisible, to complete the morning's labor before the palace seemed truly awake. By the time the gentry opened their eyes, water would already be warm for washing. This required rising hours earlier, fetching, heating, and preparing. Some water was drawn from wells or pumps within the palace grounds, but much had to be carried over distances, heavy and sloshing in iron-bound pails. The fire in the kitchens, which themselves were vast, labyrinthine places, had to be lit so that cauldrons could warm enough water to be portioned out for chamber basins. A servant might carry jug after jug through dim corridors, careful not to spill, careful not to stumble on uneven floors. These small tasks might seem ordinary, even dull, but they formed the invisible framework upon which courtly life rested. Consider, for instance, the preparation of clothing. Garments for the royal family in the court were elaborate, layered, and delicate. To dress a nobleman or noblewoman was not as simple as putting on a tunic. It was a ritual requiring several attendants, one to bring in the garments from carefully guarded chests, another to assist in fastening the many ties, laces, or buttons, and others to arrange the finer details, the fall of the sleeve, the setting of a collar, the placing of a jewel. All of this had to be laid out in advance, checked, brushed, and in some cases mended quietly during the night. Laundry was its own endless cycle. Without modern machines, clothing was scrubbed by hand in cold water, beaten, wrung out, and hung to dry in courtyards where dampness lingered. Soap was harsh, sometimes made from animal fat and ash. The result left hands raw, cracked, and smelling of lye. Yet, day after day, the linen had to be cleaned, pressed, and returned to service. Imagine yourself bent over a tub, sleeves rolled, wrists aching, knowing that however much you scrubbed a day, tomorrow would bring just as much again. Food, too, began its preparation in these early hours. Great kitchens buzzed with activity before dawn. Bakers were among the first awake, for bread was a daily staple, and it demanded time, mixing, kneading, waiting for dough to rise in warm corners near the ovens, and then baking in heavy, stone-lined hearths. The scent of yeast and with smoke filled the air as loaves emerged golden and crisp, destined for both royal tables and servant messes. Meat had to be salted, fish gutted, vegetables scrubbed, herbs chopped. Some servants would spend an entire day simply plucking poultry, their fingers sticky with down, repeating the same motion hundreds of times. Amid these labors, there were hierarchies even among servants. The youngest or least trusted performed the heaviest, dirtiest work. Older, more experienced attendants might oversee chamber duties, tending directly to lords and ladies. Some positions were oddly specialized. Keepers of the bed linens, wardens of the silver, carvers trained to slice meat with elegance at table. Each role had its place, each person bound into the larger machinery of service. Yet despite this order, life was precarious. A servant could rise in status through diligence or favor, but could also fall swiftly from grace. A dropped dish, a forgotten task, a careless word overheard could mean dismissal. To lose a palace position was to lose shelter, income, and in many cases the only means of survival. That knowledge shadowed every action. The need to be precise, to be invisible, to be tireless. It hung over each day like the toll of a bell. And still, there was a rhythm, a strange constancy. The sound of footsteps in corridors, the rustle of fabric being laid out, the murmur of voices in kitchens, the crackle of fire coaxed back to life. The palace breathed through its servants, each heartbeat measured by their endless, repeated labors. Imagine yourself in that world, rising with the earliest stirrings, knowing that your day will be shaped not by your own choices, but by the needs of others. It was not glamorous, not heroic, but it was steady. And in that steadiness lay both hardship and a certain quiet endurance. The palace was awake now. Fires burned, floors gleamed, water steamed in basins, bread cooled on racks. Lords and ladies would soon appear, stepping into this world of comfort, a world crafted entirely by the unseen hands of servants. If the early morning was devoted to setting the palace in motion, the rest of the day was consumed by a cycle of tasks that seemed never to conclude. Imagine yourself walking through the palace corridors as the sun rose higher, watching the servants bend to their endless duties. Nothing stood still for long. Rooms that had been cleaned at dawn would already need tending again by midday. Floors grew dusty, tables littered, and fabrics wrinkled from constant use. Sweeping was constant. In grand halls, rushes or straw were often spread across the floor, serving both as a covering and a way to absorb dirt. But they needed frequent replacement. Servants carried bundles of fresh rushes, scattering them across stone floors, then sweeping away the soiled layers. The smell of herbs mixed with the rushes, sweet flag, lavender, and rosemary were common, helping mask the less pleasant sense of crowded life. The rhythm of the broom was as familiar as the tolling of a bell. Furniture had to be dusted, not with soft cloths as we might imagine, but often with stiff brushes, or rags dampened with vinegar or simple lye. The grand chairs, carved with intricate patterns, collected dust in their crevices. Servants leaned close, squinting in dim light, try to coax dirt from carvings that had been designed with little thought for the difficulty of keeping them clean. Outside, too, the palace required care. Courtyards and stables were busy with movement. Horses needed feeding, grooming, and mucking out, a labor that fell to the lowest-ranked grooms. The smell of hay and manure hung heavy. Yet the animals had to be well kept, for they reflected the grandeur of the palace. Hooves were scraped clean, coats brushed until they shone, and leather tack polished to a gleam. These outdoor servants rose early and stayed late, their labor constant and physical, carried out in every season. Inside the palace, the kitchen remained its own world, never silent. As soon as one meal was finished, preparations began for the next. Cooks and their assistants chopped, ground, stirred, and baked without rest. Fires required tending all day. Ovens needed constant feeding with wood, and food had to be stored carefully in cool cellars or salted down for preservation. Rats and other vermin were perpetual enemies, forcing servants to set traps and guard stores. The work of the kitchen was both essential and exhausting, and those who labored there rarely saw the splendor of the rooms they supplied. Water remained a ceaseless demand. It was carried not just for washing and bathing, but for cleaning dishes, laundering linens, preparing food, and mixing with wine or ale. Buckets sloshed along corridors, spilling onto floors already damp from morning tasks. Servants bore the weight across aching shoulders, their steps measured, their backs bent. Imagine yourself with such a burden, the weight pressing down, the strap of the yoke cutting into your collarbone, the steady, repetitive trek from well to chamber, while the kitchen to hall. Then there were the royal chambers themselves. To serve in such spaces required discretion and precision. Beds were vast and layered. Straw mattresses, feather beds, sheets, coverlets, and canopies, each to be arranged in order. To make such a bed was not simply smoothing blankets, but assembling a structure. Pillows were fluffed, curtains tied back, sheets shaken and straightened. A poorly made bed was not merely uncomfortable. It was seen as a mark of negligence. Chamber attendants moved quietly, always aware that the royal family or courtiers might be watching. There were also the small, delicate tasks that demanded careful attention. Polishing silver and brass, arranging candles, trimming wicks so that light burned evenly and without smoke. Servants wound clocks, aired tapestries to keep moths away, and kept firewood stacked neatly. Some of these tasks took minutes, others hours, but together they filled the day in an unending chain. Laundry never stopped. Even as clean linens were being laid out, more dirty ones accumulated. Shirts, undergarments, sheets, towels, all had to be scrubbed, wrung, and dried. Washing lines stretched across courtyards, the pale fabrics rippling in the wind, like flags of labor. In colder months, drying was harder, and linens froze stiff in the air, forcing servants to beat them to softness. Hands cracked in winter, and backs ached year-round from the weight of wet cloth. There was little rest. Meals for servants were plain and often hurried. Coarse bread, broth, sometimes a scrap of meat if available. They ate quickly, standing or sitting on low benches, before returning to their posts. For every moment spent eating, there were 3 tasks waiting. Amid this relentless pace, there was also the constant presence of hierarchy. Servants answered to stewards, stewards to higher officials, and ultimately all to the master or mistress. Orders trickled down, often repeated or changed, requiring flexibility. A servant might spend an hour polishing a candlestick, only to be told the placement was wrong. Another might prepare a chamber carefully, only for the royal occupant to demand the furnishings be moved again. Obedience was essential, and patience as constant as breath. The cycle of labor, sweeping, polishing, carrying, cooking, laundering, feeding, cleaning, repeated endlessly. Imagine the sound of it. The scrape of brooms, the splash of water, the low hum of voices, the steady clatter of pots. These were not glamorous sounds, not recorded in chronicles or celebrated in song, but they were the true heartbeat of palace life. And through it all, servants remained largely invisible. Their presence was expected but not acknowledged. Rooms gleamed as though by magic. Meals appeared as though conjured. Garments were always ready. Beds always made. Fires always burning. Yet behind this seamless facade were countless weary hands, countless quiet footsteps, countless small acts of labor performed without praise. In that invisibility lay a paradox. The palace could not exist without its servants, yet their names rarely survived in history. They were the unseen foundation upon which grandeur rested, the hidden scaffolding that supported the weight of royal life. As the sun sank and shadows stretched across the palace walls, the rhythm of service did not cease. If anything, it shifted into another pattern, quieter but just as demanding. Imagine yourself in those dim corridors, the light of the day fading, candles flickering into life one by one, each flame lit by a servant's careful hand. The air changed with nightfall, cooler, stiller, yet filled with subtle sounds. The crackle of hearths, the rustle of fabric being prepared for rest, the muted tread of feet that never seemed to stop. Evening began with a great meal. Royal courts dined lavishly, often with multiple courses that demanded elaborate preparation and equally elaborate service. Servants stood ready behind chairs, waiting for signals to pour wine, to present dishes, to clear away trenchers. Imagine standing for hours, hands folded, body still, eyes alert, but never meeting those of nobility directly. Every movement was practiced, controlled, meant to be seamless. Dropping a dish or spilling wine was not simply clumsy. It could mean humiliation, punishment, or dismissal. The meal ended, but the work did not. Servants descended again into kitchens, cleaning pots blackened by fire, scraping platters, scouring goblets with sand or ash until they shone. Water was hauled in great quantities for washing. Fires were banked carefully, not extinguished entirely but subdued, so they could be rekindled in the morning. Imagine the weary arms of those who scrubbed, the ache of backs bent over cauldrons, the fatigue settling into every limb, and yet the tasks had to be done before sleep. Elsewhere, attendants prepared the royal chambers for rest. Beds were more than a place to sleep. They were symbols of wealth and power. The canopy might be embroidered with gold thread, the sheets of fine linen, the coverlets heavy with decoration. Servants ensured everything was immaculate. Feather mattresses were shaken, blankets smoothed, pillows plumped. Bed curtains were drawn close to keep out drafts, and sometimes warm bricks were slipped beneath the sheets to take away the chill. Candles were trimmed so that only a few flickered softly, casting a gentle glow until extinguished at the last moment. It was also a time of personal service. Royalty and nobility did not undress themselves. Attendants carefully removed layer after layer of garments, folding them neatly, storing jewelry, loosening laces. The body itself required tending, water brought for washing, combs and brushes prepared, perfumes or herbs used to freshen the air. Servants might even remain nearby through the night, sleeping lightly on pallets in adjoining chambers, ready to respond should their master call. Night also brought its own forms of vigilance. Guards paced slowly along battlements, torches sputtering in the wind. Within the palace, watchmen carried lanterns, checking that doors were locked, that no fire burned too fiercely, that no intruder lurked in the shadows. For some servants, night duty was as active as day, maintaining order, watching over the safety of those within. And there were still more hidden labors. Candles and lamps had to be replaced in preparation for the next morning. Ashes were cleared from hearths. Floors were swept once again. Records were kept by scribes and stewards, tallying supplies, counting stores, noting every item so that nothing was lost or stolen. The palace never truly slept. It only shifted its pace, its heartbeat steady in the hands of its workers. For the lowest servants, sleep came last and often in poor conditions. They did not rest in ornate chambers, but in simple dormitories, sometimes crowded, sometimes damp. Straw mattresses, coarse blankets, and little privacy marked their nights. The smell of smoke lingered on their clothes, the ache of labor in their bones. Yet, for all the hardship, there was a kind of constancy in their existence. Each day blended into the next. Each nightfall brought the same sequence of tasks, and so their lives passed in cycles as steady as the turning of seasons. It is worth pausing here to imagine the quiet of such a night. The grand halls darkened, the clamor of the day replaced by a softer hum. A servant might slip through a corridor with a lantern, casting long shadows on the walls. The kitchens, once noisy and filled with heat, now lay dim and still, pots stacked, embers glowing faintly. In the royal chamber, the master or mistress drifted into slumber, cocooned in luxury, unaware of the small figures who moved beyond the curtains, ensuring every detail was in order. This was the daily life of palace servants, not in moment of drama, but in the endless repetition of tasks. Sweeping, cooking, fetching, cleaning, guarding, tending. Their lives were bound by service, their identities shaped by invisibility. And yet, through their hands, the palace endured. Its fires burned, its halls shone, its rulers lived in comfort, all because of the quiet persistence of those who worked while others dreamed. Among the many positions in the palace, few carried as much responsibility and as much quiet tension as that of the chamberlain. Imagine for a moment stepping into the shoes of such a man, someone whose life was not his own, but whose every gesture helped maintain the daily rhythm of royal existence. Our figure, whom we might call Etienne, lived in France during the 15th century. His name has slipped into obscurity, preserved only in fragments of household accounts and letters. Yet through these fragments we can glimpse the shape of his days. Etienne was born not into nobility, but into modest circumstances. His father had been a steward in a smaller household, and through connections, young Etienne was apprenticed into palace service. From the beginning, his world was one of obedience and watchfulness. The chamberlain's duty was both intimate and unrelenting. He was responsible for overseeing the king's private quarters, the chamber where the monarch slept, the wardrobe where garments were stored, the small but essential details that ensured comfort and order. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. Each morning, Etienne would rise before his master, ensuring that the chamber was prepared, the fire kindled, the linens fresh, the garments laid out in proper order. He would stand silently as the king dressed, assisting with buttons and laces, offering water for washing, presenting jewels at the appropriate time. But his duties did not end there. A chamberlain often served as a kind of gatekeeper. He determined who might enter the king's private space, who might speak directly to him upon waking and who must wait. This was delicate work, for power and influence were bound tightly to access. A misplaced decision could anger nobles or insult ambassadors. Etienne had to be discreet, tactful, and ever aware of the shifting tides of court politics. His life was not his own. Meals were taken when he could spare a moment, usually hurried and plain. Sleep was shallow, for he often remained within earshot of the chamber door. He was expected to be present at odd hours, whether the king awoke in the night or demanded something before dawn. To be absent at such a moment could mean disgrace. And yet, there were rewards. A chamberlain might receive fine clothing, cast off by his master, or small gifts of money, jewelry, or land. He could rise in status, moving from simple servant to a figure of quiet influence, his proximity to the monarch making him a man to whom others bowed or whispered requests. In Etienne's case, records suggest he was entrusted with messages, perhaps even small secrets. His literacy, unusual for many servants, allowed him to handle correspondence, making him valuable in ways beyond domestic service. Still, the burden was immense. Imagine the constant vigilance, the knowledge that one misstep might undo years of loyal service. To drop a goblet, to misplace a key, to allow the wrong person into the royal presence. Any of these could end career. For some chamberlains, such errors led to dismissal. For others, to harsher punishments. Survival required both caution and resilience. What, then, was Etienne's inner life like? The records are silent, but we can imagine him standing in the flickering light of the chamber fire, holding a garment in his hands, reflecting on his place in the vast machinery of power. He would have heard whispers of politics, rumors of war, debates of ministers, all from his quiet corner of the room. He was both present and invisible, his ears filled with secrets that could never be spoken, his eyes witnessing events that were not his to shape. When the king traveled, Etienne traveled too. The chamberlain was never far from his master, arranging accommodations, ensuring that wherever the monarch slept, the chamber was ready. This meant nights on the road, hurried preparations in unfamiliar castles, adapting to circumstances while maintaining the illusion of seamless comfort. To serve was to be mobile, always alert, always ready. There must have been moments of weariness, moments when Etienne longed for rest, for the simplicity of a life not bound to another's demands. Yet his service defined him. Without it, he would have been only another nameless figure. Within it, he held a sliver of recognition, a thread of permanence in the palace records. The story of Etienne is, in many ways, the story of countless others whose names are now lost. Chamberlains, valets, attendants, men and women who lived in the shadow of power, whose days and nights were given to the service of another. Their lives were shaped not by grand deeds recorded in chronicles, but by the ceaseless repetition of duty. And in their persistence, the palace endured, day after day, year after year. Ceremony was the lifeblood of palace existence. For rulers, it was a performance of majesty. For servants, it was an unending trial of precision. To understand this more fully, let us return to the imagined life of Etienne, our chamberlain, and picture him on the morning of a grand feast. The king was to host foreign envoys, and the palace would be the stage upon which power was displayed. For such occasions, the chamberlain's responsibilities grew tenfold. The day began in darkness, as always. Etienne woke before the cock crowed, his mind already racing through the list of duties. The king's chamber had to be immaculate. Fire stoked, bed arranged, garments ready. But not ordinary garments. Elaborate robes heavy with embroidery, lined with fur, adorned with jewels. Each item had to be inspected, brushed, and laid out with care. Imagine the weight of such garments, the richness of their textures, the faint scent of lavender and cedar stored with them to keep moths away. By dawn the palace stirred. Messengers ran along corridors. Cooks shouted orders in kitchens. Stewards checked lists, and grooms prepared horses for ceremonial display. Amid this flurry, Etienne maintained his post, standing silently by the chamber door, awaiting the king's call. When it came, he entered, moving with quiet precision, presenting each garment in sequence. To button a robe incorrectly, to misplace a jewel, to delay even a moment. Such errors were unthinkable. Once the king was dressed, the chamberlain's role became that of organizer and overseer. He ensured that attendants carried torches at the correct intervals, that doors opened at the right moment, that those who sought entry were permitted in proper order. The king's procession through the palace was not spontaneous. It was choreographed. Servants like Etienne were the stagehands of this vast performance. The banquet itself was another trial. Servants carried dishes in sequence, roasted meats glistening, pies filled with spices, fish prepared with care. Wine was poured into goblets. Silver gleamed beneath candlelight. Music played softly from galleries above. Behind the scenes, servants scurried with replacements, fetching fresh trenchers, removing bones, ensuring that platters arrived warm. Etienne remained vigilant near the king, ready to anticipate a request before it was spoken. Such ceremonies could last hours, and for servants, each minute was a test of endurance. Imagine standing rigidly for hours, muscles aching, yet never shifting weight noticeably, never yawning, never betraying fatigue. Imagine balancing a tray of heavy dishes, weaving through crowded halls, careful to avoid a misstep on rush-covered floors. Every action had to be seamless, invisible, for success meant that the guests noticed nothing of the labor beneath the spectacle. For Etienne, the day might continue long after the guests had departed. Once the feast ended, the king retired and the chamberlain's duties resumed, helping remove garments, arranging the chamber for rest, ensuring that gifts or tributes received during the day were catalogued and secured. While nobles discussed politics and envoys departed with impressions of grandeur, servants remained behind, sweeping, scrubbing, storing, and preparing for the next day. And yet, within this relentless service, there were moments of proximity to power. A chamberlain might overhear conversations not meant for him, fragments of treaties, hints of alliances, whispers of rivalries. He became, in some ways, a silent witness to history. Etienne, standing in his corner, might have observed the expressions of envoys, the tones of voices, the unspoken tensions. He could never speak of it, never influence it, yet he carried those impressions like hidden knowledge. It is easy to forget how much ceremony defined palace life. Even small events, a baptism, a wedding, a royal departure, became vast productions. Servants rehearsed their roles as carefully as actors, and failure could tarnish not only individual reputation, but the honor of the court itself. For those like Etienne, success meant invisibility. If everything went smoothly, the king shone in glory and the servant faded into the background. Only in failure did the servant become visible, and then often disastrously so. These ceremonies were not rare exceptions. They were frequent, woven into the very calendar of palace life. Religious feasts, seasonal festivals, royal audiences, all required preparation. The palace was less a home than a stage, always ready for performance. And the chamberlain, like other servants, lived at the center of this theater, always present, always watching, always laboring quietly to ensure the show went on. Imagine, at the close of such a day, Etienne slipping into his narrow bed in some corner of the palace, body aching, head filled with fragments of the day's noise. The king slept in silken sheets under a canopy embroidered with gold, but the servant rested on straw, wrapped in coarse linen. Yet his mind still turned over the tasks of tomorrow, which garments to prepare, which visitors to admit, which fires to light. Sleep, when it came, was brief, and the cycle began again with the darkness before dawn. The life of a palace servant is measured not by applause, but by steadiness. For Etienne, our chamberlain, change came without drama. A faint draft in a familiar room, a pause where there had always been certainty. He rose as always, kindled the fire, smoothed the sheets, brushed the garments. Yet the rhythm felt half a beat slower, as if the palace itself were listening. It began with an inventory, the routine heartbeat of great houses. Stewards and clerks opened coffers and noted each object: robes, buckles, reliquaries, rings. On this morning, an emerald set in gold was missing from its tray. A junior valet noticed first. A steward repeated the count. A scribe wrote calmly, "Ring not found." The message spread softly along the corridor. Search again. In a palace, a lost object could be anything: mislaid, sewn into a lining, carried off with a garment for repair. Yet custom demanded certainty, and the chamberlain, guardian of the private rooms, was the one expected to provide it. Etienne opened chests, felt seams where small things slipped, and asked for more candles to chase shadows from corners. Patiently he repeated the order of recent days: who entered, who left, when the garments were changed, where the keys were hung. By evening the absence had reached the king, wrapped in understatement. No accusation, only expectation. The ring would reappear, the ledger would be amended. It did not that day nor the next. A clerk asked for a list of recent visitors. Etienne recited it, voice even. A balance scale weighed his heavy ring of keys. His small chest was opened. Spare linen, a rosary, a few coins gathered over years. The clerk closed the lid, and the room resumed its quiet. Nothing proved, nothing resolved. Consequences in such places rarely arrive as thunder. They settle like a new rule of air. A younger attendant now shared duties that had long been Etienne's alone. A steward visited more often, speaking with a shade more formality. Instructions were clearer, and the pauses longer after Etienne's replies. He went on exactly as before, lighting, laying out, guarding entry, yet the gaze upon him had shifted from trust to watchfulness. Beyond the chamber, the palace machine rolled on. Pots simmered, horses stamped, quills scratched lines of ink. Within that noise, Etienne felt the smallest misalignment, like a clock whose tick has drifted from its bell. Sleep came, but lightly. He woke at the first stir of the corridor, and worked with the practiced care of someone moving through a room of glass. Weeks later the ring returned, discovered sewn into a ceremonial robe sent to a tailor. An absent-minded fastening had hidden it. The scribe crossed out the earlier note. The steward sent word, and the matter, officially, was closed. Unofficially, a mark remained, faint but legible to those who read the air. Trust, once unsettled, does not rush back. It settles by degrees. Etienne's invitations to dine in the steward's room came less often. The junior valet lingered, learning what had once been a single person's routine, now divided into quiet halves. Nothing was said aloud. The rhythm changed and held. Palace lives rarely end in speeches. Years later, Etienne requested transfer to a lesser household tied to the court. The reason entered in the book was brief. For his health, perhaps fatigue, perhaps a wish for gentler hours, perhaps simply the tide of years. He left with a small pension, a bundle of clothing, and a loop of familiar keys that were no longer his to carry. In the quieter house, he tended fires, counted linen, and kept the habit of verification. A pocket checked twice, a class tested, a list read aloud, and then again in silence. He walked more slowly. He slept a little longer. The grand murmur of the palace receded, leaving memory as level as a sea at dawn. What remains of him is paper, entries and initials. Etienne witnessed. Etienne received. Keys balanced. Dry words, yet steady, in a margin. A clerk once scribbled a small remark on a neat hand beside a column of figures. It is not praise as a court singer gives. It is a kind of recognition servants know, brief, useful, and quietly exact. There is a gentleness to such endings that suits the niche we are wandering through tonight. No clamor, no verdict, only the soft reshaping of a life's outline. If you imagine yourself beside him, you can feel the weight of the keys replaced by the lightness of empty hands, the constant listening replaced by an easier silence. The world narrows, but also grows kinder in its predictability. The rhythm of his days slows, like distant bells taking longer between notes. Listen to the rhythm of his story. A small crisis absorbed, duties continued, an ending without spectacle. Palaces stood because such people existed, names dim in the records, hands bright with work. Their hardships were matter of fact. Suspicion that trailed without accusation, hours that lengthened without complaint. Their rewards were modest. A warm corner, a predictable meal, a sentence in a ledger that proved they had done what they said. Imagine him on his last evening in service, closing a chest and lingering a moment, not to admire its carvings, but to be sure the lock has truly caught. He pauses in a corridor, where a draft ruffles a curtain. No one notices him pass. He does not look back. He moves forward into smaller rooms and slower clocks, where the labor is the same, only lighter on the heart. And the palace he leaves behind continues, kept steady by new hands repeating the same quiet motions, day after day, night after night. Every great palace holds its mysteries. They are not always dramatic, not secret vaults filled with gold, nor lost thrones behind false walls, but subtler, quieter curiosities. For those who lived and served within, the palace itself could seem a living presence, its hallways shifting, its chambers never fully known. A servant, passing daily through the same stretch of corridor, might sense the faint draft of an opening never seen, or hear a hollow echo beneath their tread, suggesting that beneath the stones lay spaces unknown. To imagine this properly, picture yourself in the hush of an early morning before the courtiers stir. The torches are dim. The air carries a faint smell of wax and cooling ash. A servant, keys in hand, slips along a side passage. Their task is simple: to check locks, to fasten shutters. Yet their path takes them near a section the palace seldom visited. There, a narrow doorway set into the wall, boarded long ago, suggests a former stair. Records are vague. No one quite recalls when it was sealed. Still, its outline lingers, a faint scar on the plaster, whispering of another route. Historians who study these spaces often find more questions than answers. In inventories and renovation accounts, small notes appear, timber to board the old door, stone to fill the northern stairwell. Why were they sealed? To close drafts? To restrict movement? Or perhaps to limit the number of ways servants might slip unseen from one quarter to another? For in the world of palaces, movement itself was power, the ability to pass from kitchen to chamber, from hall to treasury, unseen. Corridors shape hierarchies just as much as titles did. Consider the phenomenon of hidden doors built into paneling. To the noble resident, they offered a discreet exit. To the servant, they became routine. Push here, the panel swings, the corridor narrows, the air grows cooler. Some led to service passages that wound like veins through the building, carrying food and clothing invisibly from one wing to another. Others ended abruptly, closed off after some structural shift, leaving staircases that descended into stone and stopped. Such dead ends, when rediscovered centuries later, stir a sense of quiet wonder, as though the palace wished to remind us of its layered past. Archaeologists who investigate former palaces sometimes find entire hidden chambers walled away. In one case, a modest closet was revealed behind a gallery, still lined with shelves that once held wax tablets. In another, Workers uncovered a passage used centuries before by guards to circulate unseen. The dust lay thick, and impressions of boots lingered faintly on the stone, preserved by centuries of stillness. To study such places is to feel a hush descend, the sense that life once flowed here daily, then stopped, leaving silence to accumulate like another layer of plaster. Imagine yourself standing in one of those spaces. The air is close dry, carrying the faint mineral smell of stone. The torchlight trembles on walls cut by hand centuries before. The silence is not empty but full of footsteps long gone, voices once carried in whispers, garments brushing along the wall. You might rest your hand on the cool surface and feel how solid it seems, yet how thin the line between presence and absence is. A wall here, a passage there, a life of constant motion only a few feet away. Servants, who knew the palace better than anyone, were often the keepers of these small mysteries. A chamberlain might know which panel sticks, which door creaks, which stairwell drafts in winter. A laundress might know that a particular wall warms before the others when fires are lit, hinting at a flue hidden within. These small practical knowledges were passed quietly, apprentice to apprentice, with no record in books. And yet, centuries later, when archaeologists pry open boards and trace lines of mortar, it is these forgotten footpaths that emerge again. It is tempting, lying here in the quiet, to let the imagination wander, to picture a servant pausing a sealed door, wondering what once led to imagine a child of the palace slipping into a narrow stair to listen unseen, to think of a cook hurrying a tray along a shortcut that no noble would ever notice. The palace was a grand stage for kings and queens, but beneath that spectacle lay a whole world of passages and chambers invisible to all but those who labored in them. Even today, when modern researchers skin walls with ground-penetrating radar or peel back plaster in careful squares, they often find evidence of these forgotten veins. Some hold nothing but dust and air. Others preserve fragments, a shard of pottery, a lost buckle, the stub of a candle still waxed the floor. They speak not of great events, but of ordinary acts. A servant pausing, a sleeve brushing, a hand setting something down and forgetting it. When you let the thought linger, you realize that much of history is like this. Small spaces, small acts, layered invisibly beneath the grand story. To drift into sleep while thinking of these hidden rooms is to rest among the quietest corners of the past, where the noise of court fades and only the soft echoes of footsteps remain. In the quieter hours of archaeological discovery, one often finds that the palace itself becomes a kind of storyteller. It speaks not with words, but through fragments, through layers of earth and stone, through items that once lay beneath a servant's hand before being dropped, misplaced, or deliberately hidden. These fragments, when pieced together with patience, reveal not battles or coronations, but the far subtler rhythms of existence, the kind of life that unfolded silently, unrecorded, behind the grandeur of kings and queens. Imagine the stillness of an excavation trench in the early morning. The tools rest neatly in order, brushes, small trowels, sieves. Dust lingers in the air, warmed by the first light of sun. The palace, long abandoned or restructured, rises like a husk nearby, its walls softened by time. Beneath the surface, layers wait. The tread of boots, the ashes of forgotten fires, the detritus of meals taken in haste. And with each scrape of soil removed, a story long hidden comes into focus. What emerges most often are small things. A comb, its teeth worn down, left behind perhaps in a servant's sleeping quarters. A shard of ceramic bowl, faint traces of soot still clinging to the underside where it once rested above a low flame. A clasp or pin bent slightly, its owner perhaps frustrated in the moment before discarding it. To the untrained eye these might seem insignificant, yet to historians they are evidence of daily rhythms otherwise lost. For great records speak of kings' decrees, but seldom of the girl brushing her hair by dim light before dawn, or the cook stirring a stew in the faint heat of embers. Among the most evocative finds are the tools of maintenance and labor, the quiet technologies of service. Archaeologists uncover remnants of keys, sometimes bundled together on iron rings, each once unlocking a chest, a pantry, or a side door. Their weight in the servant's hand marked responsibility, authority of a kind, though unseen by noble eyes. To hold such keys centuries later is to feel the echo of their quiet power. There are also the traces of writing, not the ornate scrolls of royal scribes, but the humbler notations of household management. On wax tablets, faint indentations linger, recording deliveries of firewood or tallies of bread loaves. These records reveal how carefully the palace balanced its needs, with for warmth, grain for bread, oil for lamps. And in those lists, one senses a human hand behind them, dipping the stylus, calculating how many bundles, how many loaves, how many hours until the next delivery. Occasionally, the earth yields more enigmatic discoveries. A bundle of textiles walled up, preserved by accident, a cache of glass beads, perhaps hidden by a maid who never returned for them. Small charms or tokens sometimes appear, slipped into cracks of walls or buried beneath thresholds. These are often interpreted as talismans, quiet acts of protection or hope, performed in secrecy by those whose lives were otherwise directed by others. Imagine a servant, finishing their day, pressing a small card beat into the earth before a doorway, whispering a hope that no fire or sickness would trouble the household. Archaeologists stumble across such acts centuries later, their meaning still palpable though never fully known. Then there are the skeletal traces of the palace's hidden population, not often human, but animal. The bones of kitchen scraps, carefully discarded, form layers that show what meals once sustained a household. Fish bones from distant seas, bird remains from local hunts, the ever-present fragments of pig or sheep. Even the smallest of these fragments tells a trade of diet, of habits long gone. In one palace site, tiny paw prints were found hardened into a once wet floor, left by a dog or cat who wandered through unnoticed. That paw, pressed into clay centuries before, now preserved forever, feels more intimate than any royal decree. Imagine yourself walking these ruins as evening falls. You pass a chamber where excavators have uncovered rows of shelves, their wood long gone, but the ghostly impressions of jars remain, like outlines of absence. Another space holds the faint marks of a hearth, where countless meals once simmered, smoke curling upward to vanish into vents unseen. In silence you can almost hear the clatter of ladles, the murmurs of cooks, the shuffle of feet carrying trays. Nothing dramatic, nothing recorded, and yet these were the beats of palace life. What is most striking in these discoveries is how they speak not only of the past, but of the continuity of human experience. The broken comb, the misplaced pin, the tally of bread, all mirror things we still do today. Someone drops a tool, someone tallies expenses, someone tucks away a trinket for luck. The difference lies not in the act, but in the setting. A palace instead of home, a servant's dormitory instead of an apartment. And so these traces remind us gently that history is not an alien land, but one we can recognize if we slow down and listen to its quieter voices. If you let yourself drift now, resting more deeply, you may picture these fragments not as objects in a museum case, but as small lights glimmering in the dim corridors of time. Each is a point of connection, a reminder that behind every grand facade were countless acts of quiet living. The palace, with all its magnificence, could not exist without these lives woven invisibly into its fabric. And in that awareness there is calm, the recognition that the ordinary has always been the foundation of the extraordinary. It is in the soft clatter of dishes, the flicker of lamplight, the worn comb on a bedside table, that history becomes most intimate, most human, and most restful to imagine. Not all traces of a palace are purely practical. Some reach deeper, into the realm of ritual, belief, and memory, the unseen framework that gave meaning to daily labor. For behind every meal served, every chamber swept, every fire tended, there was also a rhythm of customs and gestures, half practical, half sacred, woven into the very architecture of the place. Archaeologists, when they stumble across hints of these acts, find themselves not just reconstructing lives, but sensing the thoughts and hopes that once animated them. Consider the threshold of a great hall. Beneath its stones, excavations sometimes reveal curious objects. Shards of pottery deliberately broken, animal bones arranged in patterned deposits, or small coins scattered in the soil. These are interpreted as foundation offerings, tokens placed by builders or servants when the palace was raised, meant to bless or protect the structure. Centuries later, when the building still stood, those who passed over those thresholds each day unknowingly walked above layers of quiet intention. In other cases, niches built into walls reveal faint traces of once burning lamps. Soot marks cling above them like ghostly shadows, testimony to the steady glow that lit prayers or warded off misfortune. Servants might have tended these flames without ceremony, adding oil, trimming wicks, ensuring their persistence. Yet in doing so, they upheld a rhythm of ritual that stretched back generations. Even the act of cleaning ashes from a hearth could carry symbolic weight. The removal of the old, the preparation for the new. Imagine a moment at dusk, centuries ago, when the palace shifted from activity to repose. Fires were dampened, lamps trimmed low. Servants moved through the halls in near silence, sweeping, closing shutters, preparing for rest. Perhaps one lingered at a small alcove, placing a sprig of greenery, or whispered a few words to ensure safety through the night. Such acts left no written trace, yet they were as vital as any proclamation. To maintain a household was not only to preserve order, but also to guard its unseen spirit. Some archaeological discoveries hint at personal rituals carried by individuals. Small carved figures, worn smooth from handling, suggest tokens of protection carried in pockets or hidden in bedding. Simple marks etched on doorframes may have been charms against illness or theft. Even graffiti scratched into plaster, initials, symbols, brief phrases, reveals a human urge to leave a mark, however small, in the vast anonymity of a palace. One can imagine a young servant pausing in a quiet corridor, quickly inscribing a shape with a knife tip before hurrying on, never knowing that centuries later those faint lines would still speak. At times, entire rooms take on ritual meaning. Archaeologists sometimes identify chambers where patterns and residue suggest repeated, focused activity, perhaps prayers, perhaps initiations, perhaps simply routines of cleansing or blessing. In such spaces, silence itself becomes a presence. The air feels charged, the walls carrying the memory of countless small acts layered one upon another. Walking into such a chamber even today, one feels a hush, as though the room remembers. There are also the echoes of communal ritual, moments when the palace's entire body of workers and residents partook in shared rhythm. Festivals, recorded in fragmentary notes, often required elaborate preparations. Kitchens labored to produce dishes beyond the ordinary. Halls were dressed in greenery, lamps lit in profusion. Servants, though weary, found themselves caught in a current of festivity, contributing not only to the feast, but to the atmosphere of renewal. Archaeological traces of these moments survive in heaps of discarded vessels, charred bones from feasts, and unusual concentrations of lamp fragments. These remains, though mute, carry the flavor of celebration, a palace breathing as one. What lingers most, however, are the subtle signs of memory itself. In some ruins, one finds spaces deliberately untouched during renovations, as though preserved for reasons no record explains. Was it respect? Fear? A decision that this place must remain as it is? Sometimes a wall is left unplastered, or a stairwell left sealed but not destroyed. Such gestures suggest a recognition of memory beyond utility. The palace itself became a vessel of remembrance, its forgotten corners holding silent tribute to moments or people now unknown. As you picture these discoveries, let yourself imagine the layers of intention that build up over time. The broken shard beneath the threshold, the lamp niche blackened with soot, the faint carved symbol on the wall. All these are echoes, soft as breath, yet enduring across centuries. They remind us that even in environments dominated by hierarchy and display, the human need for meaning quietly persisted. And so, as your thoughts slow and drift toward rest, you may picture the palace not as a ruin but as a living body of memory. Corridors still hold the warmth of countless footsteps. Chambers still hum faintly with whispered words. In each sealed wall, each hidden offering, there remains the echo of human presence, ordinary yet profound. To lie in the stillness of night while thinking of these things is to share in that quiet continuity, where the boundaries between past and present, ritual and rest, slowly dissolve. As we leave behind the fragments of archaeology and the quiet records of forgotten service, it is natural to look upward beyond the hidden staircases and servant corridors, toward the rooms of ceremony, brilliance, and power. For every unseen hand that polished brass or carried water, there was another life being lived under the dazzling glow of chandeliers and within the perfumed air of the royal apartments. And it is here, in the contrast between the invisible workers and the most visible figures of all, that the picture of palace life truly comes alive. Imagine now, after following the faint traces of servant's world, stepping through a different door, one that does not creak with neglect, but swings wide with deliberate grandeur. The room beyond is vast, hung with tapestries embroidered in bright silks and glowing gold thread. The floor beneath your feet is polished so highly that candle flames seem to ripple across it like water. Here, every object is designed not for necessity but for display. Even the air itself is heavy with scent. Rare spices, exotic perfumes, the waxy fragrance of endless candles burning, so many that shadows are banished from the corners. This was a world of kings, queens, and high nobility, where daily life appeared to be wrapped in leisure and spectacle. A courtier might spend an entire morning attending a single ceremony, the rising of the monarch, known in France as the Lever du Roi or the King's Rising. This ritual was an orchestrated performance where servants, nobles, and dignitaries gathered simply to witness the monarch awaken, dress, and prepare for the day. What might seem the most private routines was instead transformed into a stage where power was displayed in its smallest details. A golden comb, a velvet robe, a jewel fastened at the collar. Each act, no matter how trivial, reinforced the distance between ruler and subject. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, palace life was not without its own quiet strains. Nobles, though freed from the endless labor service, were not free in the modern sense. Their lives were bound to etiquette, to the unspoken laws of court behavior. A gesture too bold, a glance misinterpreted, a word misplaced, such small missteps could mean disgrace, banishment from court, or the end of influence. Thus, even amid luxury, there was a constant pressure of vigilance that weighed upon the elite as surely as drudgery weighed upon the servant. The servants, watching from the margins, understood these dualities well. They moved silently through ceremonies, carrying trays, adjusting garments, standing just beyond notice, but always aware. To them, the monarch was both impossibly distant and immediately human. Someone whose slippers they fetched, whose spilled drink they cleaned, whose discarded cloak they folded carefully. To serve was to live at the border between grandeur and fragility, between the myth of royalty and the quiet, daily evidence of its reality. Consider, for example, the feast that unfolded in these halls. Long tables grown with platters of roasted game, exotic fruits, confection sculpted into elaborate forms. Goblets of silver and gold gleamed in the candlelight. Music drifted from galleries where musicians played softly. Yet behind the magnificence was ceaseless labor. Servants ensured that every plate arrived steaming, that every goblet was filled before it emptied, that the monarch's slightest gesture was met with swift response. The nobles and attendants might appear to dine with effortless grace, but each bite was made possible by dozens of hands working in precise coordination. And yet, for the nobles themselves, these feasts were rarely simple pleasures. Each seat at the table carried meaning. To sit nearer the monarch was to be seen, to have influence. To be placed at the far end was a silent reminder of waning favor. Every conversation carried weight. Every word could ripple through the court in ways that altered fortunes. To eat in such a setting was to perform, to laugh at the right moment, to murmur admiration at the right compliment, to hold one's posture as carefully as a soldier holds a weapon. So we see the parallel. Servants toil with physical constancy, while nobles toil with social vigilance. Both groups, though separated by vast status, lived under forms of pressure. For one, it was the endless cycle of duties. For the other, the endless cycle of appearances. In both, the palace was a place of confinement as much as grandeur. It is easy to imagine the resentment that might stir in a servant's heart, watching silks trail across marble while their own hands were red with labor. Yet it is equally possible to imagine a noble's envy of the servant's freedom to move unseen, to slip away into the quieter corners of the palace, out of the spotlight of expectation. Both lives were shaped by the palace, each in its own way a cage, one gilded, the other bare. As the day unfolded in these grand apartments, rhythms of service and ceremony intertwined. The nobles whispered strategies in corridors, plotting marriages or alliances. The servants carried coals to stoke fires, changed linens, polished silver. And in the middle of it all stood the monarch, a figure both impossibly elevated and curiously fragile, dependent on all who surrounded them, from the highest minister to the humblest page. Thus, to understand palace life fully, one must see not just the servants and not just the elite, but the constant interplay between the two. For grandeur could not exist without labor, and labor gained meaning only in relation to grandeur. It is in this delicate balance, the shadows and the splendor, the unseen and the celebrated, that the palace becomes not only a building of stone and gold, but a living organism where each part, high or low, beats in rhythm with the whole. Let us imagine once again standing in the heart of a palace, but this time not during a feast or morning ritual. Picture instead the slower hours of a royal day, when courtiers lingered in galleries, waiting to be noticed, and servants hovered in quiet readiness. The palace, though outwardly serene, thrummed with expectation. Each moment was charged with possibility. The chance to be summoned, the chance to serve, the chance to rise, or to fall. For nobles, presence was everything. To be absent from court was to risk irrelevance. And so, even when no ceremony demanded it, they remained nearby, polished and prepared, ready to perform their roles. A noble woman might spend hours arranging her garments, so that each fold of silk lay gracefully, not because comfort required it, but because being seen required it. A courtier might rehearse lines of flattery or wit, not for private amusement, but for public effect. These were not idle tasks. They were strategies of survival, for favor was the true currency of the court. And as nobles maneuvered with subtle glances and practiced bows, servants worked in the margins, sustaining the illusion of ease. A cushion was fluffed before it was needed. A goblet was refilled before thirst was spoken. A candle was replaced before darkness could intrude. The nobles might imagine themselves the stars of performance. But without the servants, the stage itself would collapse. It is here that one sees a curious truth. The palace was not only a place of hierarchy, but a place of dependence. The highest depended on the lowest, though rarely acknowledged it. A noble might dismiss a servant with a gesture, yet in the same breath rely on that servant to maintain the delicate web of appearances that define court life. The burdens of this theater were heavy for both sides. Servants endured long hours, repetitive tasks, and little recognition. Nobles endured endless scrutiny, constant performance, and the risk of disgrace. It is tempting to imagine the nobles as entirely privileged, but within their world, privilege came wrapped in chains. A servant could slip unnoticed into shadow. A noble could not escape the spotlight, even for a moment. Consider, for instance, the elaborate etiquette of conversation. A noble approaching the monarch did not simply speak. They performed a dance of bows, carefully chosen words, and studied expressions. A misstep might be remembered for years, whispered in corners, used against them at a later moment. The servant, standing nearby, witnessed this silent drama daily. They saw how power, though glittering, was fragile, how influence, though sought, was fleeting. Even recreation bore the weight of expectation. When the court gathered for hunting or for games in the gardens, the events were not merely diversions, but opportunities for display. A nobleman's skill with a bow or a noblewoman's elegance in dance were more than talents. They were signals, messages, ways of securing favor or alliance. Servants repaired the horses, carried the equipment, fetched refreshments, and observed quietly. For them, the spectacle was endless work. For the nobles, endless performance. It is striking, too, to notice the silence of servants in the historical record, contrasted with the endless words written about the elite. Chroniclers describe robes and jewels in detail, ceremonies and flourish, intrigues and gossip. But behind every jeweled shoe was someone kneeling to fasten it. Behind every royal procession was someone sweeping the path. History, in its glitter, forgot them, and yet their presence was constant, as steady as breath. The deeper one looks, the more the palace appears not as a home, but as a stage. The throne was the centerpiece, the monarch the lead actor, courtiers the supporting cast, and servants the stagehands who ensured the performance never faltered. Without them, the illusion would crumble. Without the illusion, power itself might fracture. And so, the burdens of display fell on all. Nobles bore the anxiety of being seen. Servants bore the exhaustion of remaining unseen. The palace was both dazzling and suffocating, a place where lives, though separated by vast differences in wealth and privilege, were equally bound by duty. One might polish a goblet, another might polish a sentence of flattery, but both labored in service of the same glittering, fragile machine. As the day faded into evening, the theater of power only deepened. Torches were lit, music filled the halls, and new ceremonies unfolded. The nobles adjusted their postures once more. The servants prepared for another long night. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps in a quiet corridor or on a cold stone stair, a servant exhaled a weary breath, while in the glowing hall a noble forced a smile. Both, in their own ways, carried the burdens of display. The palace, as we have seen, was a place of theater, but it was also a place of shadows. Behind every noble who basked in candlelight stood a servant in the half-dark, close enough to hear every word, far enough to never be truly seen. In this final part of our exploration of social contrast, let us pause to look closely at those shadows and at the strange, unspoken relationship between the powerful and those who served them. Nobles were raised to believe that their lives carried immense significance. Every gesture, every garment, every alliance was woven into the tapestry of history. Their names were recorded in chronicles, carved into monuments, preserved in letters and songs. Yet the servants who brushed their cloaks, who tended their wounds, who comforted them in illness or celebrated their victories, were rarely named. Their stories dissolved into silence. And yet, in quiet ways, servants shaped the rhythm of noble life. Consider the chamber servant, who woke before dawn to prepare clothing and warm water. Their hands arranged the garments that would later dazzle at court, or the cook, who oversaw the preparation of countless meals, their choices of spice or presentation subtly influencing the moods of the gatherings, or the stable hand, whose attention to the smallest detail might prevent a noble's horse from faltering in a parade or hunt. It is easy to imagine nobles as distant, untouchable figures, but in truth, their days were threaded with moments of vulnerability, and in those moments, servants became essential. A feverish monarch, sweating in the night, did not call for a council of advisors, but for the servant who brought cool water and fresh linen. A grieving noblewoman, cloaked in sorrow, leaned not on her rivals at court, but on the maid who offered a quiet word of comfort. Service, though invisible in the records, was a fabric of survival. Still, the line of separation remained stark. For all their closeness, servants could never cross into equality. A misplaced glance, a word spoken too freely, a failure to bow at the right moment. These small errors could result in punishment or dismissal. Trust was fragile, and dependence never erased hierarchy. The paradox of palace life was this: intimacy and distance existed at once. Servants knew their masters more closely than anyone else, yet remained forever apart. This contrast extended even into rest. A noble might sleep on feather mattresses, draped in silk, beneath a canopy embroidered with golden thread. A servant, having laid out those sheets and smoothed those pillows, might sleep on a straw pallet in a corner of the palace, where drafts crept through the stone walls. The same roof covered them both, but the distance between their lives was vast. And yet, and this is worth dwelling on, there were moments when the gulf seemed to narrow. A shared laugh in the kitchens, when a mishap sent flour into the air. A hurried glance exchanged in the corridors, when gossip passed faster than words. A gesture of kindness, when a noble offered coins or thanks in private, acknowledging what public etiquette ignored. These moments, though fleeting, remind us that beneath layers of duty and hierarchy, the human bond remained. The contrast between elite and servant was not absolute separation, but constant negotiation. Servants shaped the palace even as they were shaped by it. Nobles relied on service even as they denied its value. Together, they created a world that was dazzling on the surface and fragile beneath. To walk through that world in imagination is to notice both the glitter and the shadow, the polished marble that reflected candlelight, and the worn steps and hidden stairways where servants hurried unseen. It is to notice that history, often told from the vantage point of the throne, is incomplete without the quiet labor that held the throne aloft. And so, as segment 4 draws to a close, we find ourselves in that liminal space between nobility and service, privilege and burden, light and shadow. The palace was never only about kings and queens, dukes and duchesses. It was also about the countless unnamed hands that steadied crowns, poured wine, swept floors, and stitched garments. Without them, the glitter of court life would have been impossible. In this contrast, we glimpse a larger truth about history itself. That it is not only the deeds of rulers that matter, but also the endurance of those who serve them. The past is made not of single voices, but of a chorus, some loud, some hushed. And though the voices of palace servants may be hushed, they are not absent. They remain, if we choose to listen, in the faint echoes of footsteps along stone corridors, in the scent of wax and rushes, in the weight of silence that lingers after ceremony fades. As we come to the end of this long and winding journey through the corridors of palaces and the lives that once filled them, let us pause to reflect. Together we have moved through glittering halls and quiet kitchens, through chambers of luxury and stairwells of shadow. We have watched noble perform their endless theater of status, and we have followed servants as they sustained that performance with tireless, invisible labor. What emerges is a vision of history that is not one-sided, but layered. The palace was not only marble and silk, jewels, and ceremony. It was also stone floors worn smooth by hurried footsteps, calloused hands carrying burdens, soft whispers in the night when candles burned low. To see the past clearly is to see both, the radiance and the weight, the display and the duty. Perhaps, in this contrast, we find something familiar, for those centuries divide us from those who lived in palaces. The themes remain timeless. The desire for recognition, the pressure of expectation, the reliance on others that often goes unnoticed. These belong not only to nobles and servants, but to all human lives. We, too, live in a world of roles, of performances, of quiet labors that sustain the visible. History, in this way, becomes not distant but near, reminding us that human experience is a thread that stretches unbroken across ages. And as the final candle burns low in our imagined palace, we let the sounds fade, the murmurs of courtiers soften into silence, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen's quiets. Even the footsteps of servants retreat down shadowed corridors until all that remains is stillness, a stillness deep enough to invite rest. Here, in this stillness, you may let go of the noise of your own day. Just as the palace sleeps after its long rituals, you too may find rest after yours. The burdens of display, the weight of labor, the endless cycles of expectation. For now, all can be set aside. What remains is only the gentle breath of history, a reminder that even the busiest worlds eventually fall silent. So close your eyes if you have not already. Imagine the faint glow of torchlight fading from the walls, the echo of footsteps dissolving into distance. Imagine the palace in darkness, cradled by the quiet of night. And within that darkness, allow yourself to drift, carried gently by the same silence that once soothed weary nobles and tired servants alike. Sleep comes softly, as it always has, wrapping the past and present together in one calm embrace. Let it take you peacefully into the hush beyond history. Good night.